morning, as we get to be in this place and lean into our time together, we're going to spend this morning in Mark chapter 9. Last Sunday, we began this conversation around these bold statements that Jesus makes. Bold statements he makes about his coming crucifixion and his coming resurrection. And at that time, on that side of the cross, people were confused. They were scratching their heads over all these things that Jesus was saying. You see, towards the front of the chapter, there's this moment where Jesus actually picks a couple of his disciples. He picks a few of his friends, James, Peter and John. He says, all right, let's come together. And he actually brings them up to the side of a mountain, away from everyone else. And this moment is known as the Transfiguration. It's this moment of just immense power being shown of who Jesus is. This powerful moment where the four of them are up in the mountains, secluded and cut off from the rest of society and the others too. And there they are, and there's this moment where they're covered. I mean, they're covered in sweat and grime and filth and dirt from hiking up the mountain, right? It is no easy task. Here we don't really have mountains in our landscape, but we can just step outside, right? We just step outside and then we sweat, right? And so just imagine you went and got mail from the mailbox during the middle of August, right? They are drenched in sweat, and they in this moment, all of a sudden, I mean, they're curious of why they're even there. I remember being a kid, my grandfather would say, "Hey, get in the truck. We're heading into town." And I'm like, "Where are we going? What are we doing?" He'd say, "You'll see. We'll see." Right? And as a kid, I always hated that statement. But now as a parent, like, I love it. It's the best. It's the best couple of words in the world, right? When kids ask what we're doing, and you say, "You'll see. You'll see." He said, "You'll see." There they are, and all of a sudden, Jesus begins to kind of radiate all this light, and he begins to show that he was God to these few men that were with him. It's a beautiful moment. And actually, they're so in awe of it, then all of a sudden, Jesus is joined by two other men. These two other men then appear, these men who at first, Peter, James, and John, didn't really know who they were, but through the dialogue of listening in to Jesus' conversation with them, they picked up very quickly who these guys were. It was Moses and it was Elijah. These two great men of God who had lived centuries earlier, but now we're there. And they're witnessing this moment. And Peter, just this guy who just kind of, he talks before he thinks, like a lot of us perhaps even. And he says, Jesus, should we build a house? Should we build a structure here for everyone to live in? Because this is a good moment. And then before even Jesus responds to him, as they're there on the mountainside, then a thick, dense cloud surrounds them. And with a loud, thundering voice, they hear that this is my son. Listen to him. Listen to him. No ifs, ands, or buts. Listen to him. Well, you see, after the moment is over and they're coming back down the mountain, the men that Jesus had brought with him were still just trying to put words to what they were thinking. They didn't know what to ask. Their minds were in a daze. They were so lost of what was happening. And then in the sense of that moment, as they're coming down the mountain, Jesus actually speaks aloud to what is in their mind. It's this beautiful moment where they don't really want to be embarrassed by talking out loud, but Jesus then kind of brings forth the questions that are raging on inside of them. And you see, there's this moment in chapter 9, verse 12, where Jesus begins to say this to them. In verse 12, it says, "To be sure, Elijah does come first and restore all things. Why then is it written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected?" Wow. I mean, Jesus is asking this question out loud that even then is referring back to himself. Because here in this moment, these men they see a window into who Jesus really is. And then it dawns on them of man, why does Jesus have to, go to the cross? Why does he have to suffer? These things come to their mind, and it's this moment. It's this moment where he begins even to respond to his own question. He says, the people back then, they hated Elijah. They tortured Elijah, and people haven't changed. Why would we expect people to change any different towards the Son of Man who has come? And Jesus is the one that says it out loud, but it is in their mind. And you see, Jesus doesn't beat around the bush with this whole thing. The crucifixion, his death and resurrection was not a surprise. It was one that he had talked about coming up. And you see there and towards the end of chapter 9 is when he makes his second bold statement about his death and about his resurrection, about his suffering. See, in verse 30, he is back with all of his crew. They're all together, and there's perhaps even a few other stragglers too that are along as well. You see, it says that they left that place and passed through Galilee. And Jesus did not want anyone to know where they were because he was teaching his disciples. He wanted to make sure that it was just them that he was trying to bring along, that he didn't want them lost in what was happening. It says that he said to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. It says there, as he says he's being delivered, he means betrayed. He'll be betrayed. He'll be handed off. He'll be given over to people, and they will kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise. And then in verse 32, it says, but they did not understand what he meant, and were afraid to ask him about it. Now, this is the second time, friends. This is the second time that they've heard Jesus point to the cross. They've pointed to the resurrection. And they're so lost in all of it. They're so confused. And in this moment, they were afraid. They didn't want to ask. Oh, could you imagine this moment where Jesus says something so bold and then crickets? And how's the weather? They just what do you say next in that time? They're so lost in it. I mean, oh my goodness. Because the disciples had seen Jesus do powerful things. I mean, miracles beyond what people can imagine. Heal hundreds and hundreds of people with numerous of different physical ailments. He's seen people that he's seen cured of diseases and cast out demons. On multiple occasions, he's multiplied just a little bit of food to feed thousands of people. And in multiple situations, they've seen him simply speak out loud and tell a storm to go away. In a couple of different moments, they're out in the water on boats, and the waves are going crazy, and the storm is insane, and Jesus just speaks. And the thunder and lightning and the darkness and the wind just go away. They've seen him do so many miracles and show his power that he was God. He is God. But why? Why would he let himself be betrayed? Why would he let himself be handed over and to be hurt? So even to use the same words that Jesus used there as he talked in verse 12, why would he even choose suffering? Have you ever asked this question? Because it's one that we kind of gloss over when we celebrate Easter. Perhaps this is not your first Easter weekend that you've celebrated, that our King has risen, that we're grateful for his work on the cross, and we're so grateful that he is alive. If it is, perhaps I'm beyond grateful that you're here this morning. That is your first time getting to hear this story. And oh my goodness, could we get coffee and talk more about it? But oh my goodness, this is something that we gloss over. Because as people just familiar with this story, we don't really take into account why the King of the universe, who created all of this, subjected himself to such suffering. Because I don't know about you, but for me, I know in my life, I usually try to avoid suffering. On a Tuesday morning, I'm pretty sure Aaron would take me to the hospital if I woke up and I said, Aaron, today I'm feeling like I want a little bit of hardship. I want a little bit of that. She would take me like, your mind is messed up. I mean, we are people who avoid this stuff, and he knows that it's coming. Why would he hand himself over to it and choose it? You see, there's the textbook intellectual reason behind it. But then there's the heart reason. See, in one sense, the intellectual textbook, what we know about why his death on the cross is so significant, is two sides to the same coin. And in one sense, it was promised over and over again throughout all of the Old Testament. I mean, understand that there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of promises about the life of Jesus made hundreds, thousands of years before he lived, and he fulfilled all of them. There were all sorts of people who said, hey, I'm the Messiah, right? All sorts of people claimed to be this, but they missed and did not live up to all of these things. And one of the promises that was repeated many times, especially by Elijah and Isaiah as well, was that it would be promised that he would suffer, that he would be betrayed, and they'd be handed over to people who would do excruciating harm and pain to him. But you see, a part of that same coin on the other side, understand that Jesus' death atones for our sin. It's this big fancy word. This is atonement part of what we know to be true about the Christian faith and walking as the people of God and living and following Jesus. Understand that when God created people and we chose sin and we welcomed sin in, we let it in the back door and it destroyed the whole house. I mean, oh my goodness, we welcomed it in. God did not create evil. We brought evil into the world. And you see, through all of it, as humanity, as the people of God would live in darkness and live and do things that were wrong, God wanted to make a way for them to live in harmony with each other and to live in harmony with him. And so God in the Old Testament creates the law. And the law is this place in this kind of book of Leviticus and parts of the Old Testament where we understand how people can live in harmony with each other and what happens when they don't. Talks about physical consequences when people steal from each other, when they kill people, when they do all sorts of things, right? They murder others and they do despicable things. He teaches them this is how a people live in harmony, and this is what justice looks like when you betray or harm or do something wrong to each other. But then in that same sense, God tried to teach the people of the Old Testament that every time they did something wrong, they not only harmed a person or themselves, they also harmed God. And so God created animal sacrifice, this rhythm, this practice where they would very visually see how their sin and their ways of selfishness would do and create pain in the world, and there would not only be physical consequences, but spiritual consequences. And so instead of the spiritual consequences resting on people, God said, allow those consequences to rest on animals or certain types of livestock that people would raise or crops that they would grow. And he would teach them all these different ways that all these different sacrifices could take on the consequence of their sin. But you see, it only ever went an inch deep, because all of this never really got to the real cause that is inside every single person, to be stubborn and to be rebellious and to be selfish. At the nature of what sin is simply selfishness. And so understand that God sees that he had created something temporary just to bring them into the light, to understand the reality of the world, so that one day he could step into the world. That way God could be a good father who rolls up his sleeves and he puts on his boots and he steps into the mess of the farm pen or the sheep pen. I mean, I had a good friend of mine who grew up in a farm, and I loved going to his house because I loved to see all the animals, and I loved, you can go walk out in the field. And you know, if you've been to a farm, that you have to watch where you step, because there are pies everywhere, aren't there? And oh my goodness, God put on his boots and he was not afraid to step into the pen of the world that we had made, and we had made a mess. We had made a mess. Jesus comes into the world, lives a perfect life, God in the flesh, who would set aside his even claim and even his sense of level and superiorness of being God, that he could be with us. It's like he took off his suit and tie to come join us on the job site of some blue-collar people. Come be with us. And he lives this life of caring for people and encouraging people, all so that he would one day be rejected by the same people that he cared for, and that he would be sacrificed. He'd allow himself to be hung to a executionary style way of killing criminals. That way he could take on the spiritual consequences of our sin. See, that is the intellectual reason and understanding of why the suffering, but even then it still says, why still, why still? And that then comes to the heart reason. The heart reason of why the cross. Why did Jesus choose suffering? You see, that's actually the very core of this moment in Mark chapter 9. Because the people were familiar with some sense of the Old Testament, what was happening, and the bridges and the connections there, but they were still so lost of why all this was happening. You see, back to the moment where Jesus told them that he would soon be betrayed, he'd be executed, and then 3 days later rise from the dead, and they weren't paying a lick of attention to him because they were afraid to respond. They were afraid of even embarrassing themselves. It says next in the moment, in verse 33, it says, they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them. So there they are. Chapter 9, verse 33. Liam, if you want to catch up with me, brother, we're on verse 33. Okay, brother, we're in the next slide. So they come to this place. They're in the house. And this moment where Jesus kind of calls it out of them. He says, what were you arguing about on the road? But they kept quiet. And listen to this. Because on the way, they had been arguing about who was the greatest. Like, oh my goodness. I mean, there they were. They're traveling down the way. And they hear Jesus talk about how he will soon go to the cross. And soon all of this will happen. But oh my goodness, how crazy is this? That while this is happening, they're talking about who's better, who's stronger. I mean, this is great. I mean, it's a great reminder that his disciples were these teenage young adult guys. I mean, think of a bunch of 17, 18-year-old guys of like, my muscles are bigger than yours, right? And like, I'm invincible. Like, I bet I could pick up that rock and throw it further than you, right? And all this stuff of like, oh, I'm smarter than you. And just all this competitive stuff that is just raging in them. I mean, just imagine this moment. It's like you're back in the high school with the drama. It's just everywhere. Oh, I mean, how thick in the head do you have to be to listen to Jesus talk and say that he'll be betrayed and tortured and killed, and then to go right to seeing who was better? And you see, when Jesus asked them with what they're talking about, I have to imagine that they all like looked at each other in the eyes and they just said, nothing, right? Nothing. We were talking about nothing. We see in the next verse, in verse 35, it says this. It says, sitting down. You see, there are a lot of moments where Jesus teaches and corrects and encourages his disciples and people. But, you know, kind of like shooting off the hip right now, I'm pretty sure this is the only moment where Jesus says, oh my goodness, I need to sit down. Like, oh my goodness, you're so not getting it. I need to sit down. This is so, we got to start from the beginning. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servants of all. Wow. Jesus was flipping on its head the way that the world worked. That to be the best, you had to be the best. To be the greatest, you had to be first, and you had to push yourself in front of the line, and you had to do what you could do to get there. And those were the people who had it all figured out and had it all right. And Jesus flips the way of the world on its head and says, no, you don't understand. If you want to be winner, you actually have to be in last place. You have to put yourself at the lowest place. And you see, this is what Jesus is beginning to get to. Because in the moment of allowing himself to have rumors said about him and allowing people to make false accusations about him, he allows people to paint this image of him as a criminal, brought to the very bottom of society. He was already pretty low down the totem pole. He was born into a peasant household with very little money. I mean, oh my goodness, at some point in his childhood growing up, his father dies, and so he grows up even in a single motherhood household, and oh my goodness, he doesn't come from a wealthy family by any means, or a family of respect at all, or from even a community of respect. He grows up on the wrong side of the tracks. But he allows people to bring him even lower so that through his suffering, he could hold up a mirror to us. That he could hold up a mirror to people and understand that the cross shows us our problem with pride. And this is the very heart of the issue of what Jesus is trying to get across the table to us. Is that he chose suffering. The King of the world chose suffering. Yes, for all of the reasons that teach us so, but also to get right to the heart of why humanity is, why we are the way we are. Our stubbornness, our sense of rebelliousness from authority, that we are where we are because there's a problem with pride inside of us. And understand the same humility that it took for Jesus to hand himself over and to be crucified is the same humility that we must have to receive his rescue. I want to say that again. The same humility it took for Jesus, the King of the universe, to hand himself over and be crucified is the same humility that we need to receive his rescue. This is why the crowds hated him, because they wanted a king who rides into the city on a stallion with giant swords and power and authority and to just tear off the roof of Rome. But instead they get this guy who rides in on a donkey. Instead they get this suffering servant. They wanted a king of status. They wanted a king with great booming voice that people would just listen to and they would respect out of fear. But they instead get Jesus, this one who is quiet, this one who spends time with sinners, laughing and eating with them. Why they rejected him. And understand that people today, we have the same response to Jesus. You see, for those who wouldn't call themselves a Christian, I had a great friend of mine when I was young. His name was Adam, and we worked together. I worked at a local pizza place growing up as a kid, and when I was in high school. And oh my goodness, I remember getting to build this friendship with this guy named Adam, and he didn't believe in Jesus. He didn't want anything to do with it, anything to do with the way of the Christian faith. And I didn't come from a Christian household. I didn't grow up in any of this, but I'd surrendered my heart to Jesus when I was about 15, 16 years old. And so there we are working together. I was talking with him about faith, and he goes on to share. He's like, I know the story of Easter. It actually happened to be Easter weekend, and we were working together. He said, I know the story of Easter, the Christian story of Easter, of Jesus being on the cross and doing all of that for humanity. And he said, I didn't need Jesus to do that for me. I didn't need him to suffer all of that for me. And you see, understand there's this sense of stubbornness we have. There's this pride that we have when we're apart from God that says, I don't really need that. I can do life on my own. I don't really need Jesus to do all that for me. I don't really need God to even rescue me. I don't need his freedom. I'm fine. And so we are people who have this heart, and we look to God, and we hear the story of the cross, and we say, yeah, it's great for you, but I don't need it for me. And yes, you do. Yes, I did. Yes, all of us did and do. Oh my goodness, but our pride pushes us the other way. And somehow we still, even people apart from God, believe that when they die, they'll just try to be a good person throughout their life. But when they die, they'll just somehow live in peace. I remember asking him, peace created by who? He's like, I don't know, just peace that would be there. But created by who, though? Like, how to get there? See, there's a stubbornness that keeps us. A lot of people love to attempt to keep a distance from God for all sorts of reasons that they believe, but they don't intend to ever actually research or dive in because they really, at the sense, don't want God. And you understand that even for those who believe, we still have this issue with pride because perhaps we're not all the way there of not wanting God, but we certainly are people who try to meet God in the middle. And you see, this is very much alive in our journey as people of faith in two very real ways. And the first sense is that we treat our faith as a get-out-of-jail-free card. That it's fire insurance that we hold on to, and that somehow we can believe that God is real, and that somehow we'll try to be good, and so his blessing and goodness will be alive in our life. And then we're like shocked when life goes off the rail because we thought that if we kind of are good enough, then life will be good for us. So we're angry. We're angry when things don't go our way. We're people who perhaps they say we believe in God, but we don't really belong to him. We love to have our way, and we like to sprinkle a little bit of Jesus every now and then, like a spice we keep in our back pocket. And see, we're people who try to meet God in the middle of saying, you know what, thank you for rescuing me. Thank you for setting me free, but I'm also going to stay where I'm at, and I'm going to do me. Like, you do you. Like, thank you. Like, some people will be more serious and walk with you. That's great, but I'm gonna keep doing me. And it's pride that keeps us in this place of thinking that we know what's best for our life instead of the one who created life, who created us, who made us. But you see, in the other sense, perhaps if we're not in that place of meeting God in the middle, we actually become people who are very prideful in our ways of trying to sacrifice ourselves right along with Jesus. You see, perhaps if you're a person, and right now I am preaching to myself, if you are a person who has a hard time receiving gifts from people, then how on earth can we really receive the greatest gift from our King? We are a people who love to sacrifice ourselves in a way that it costs us, and we look at our costs as a measurement of God, aren't you proud of us? And don't understand the King of the world is cheering us on. He's with us in the fight and all those things, but we try to use our suffering as a way of measuring where we are. You know, over the last year of my life, God has brought people into my life who've been very generous and caring and blessing Aaron and I and our family, and the Lord has had to teach me, and he has straightened out even the pride inside of me that loves to sacrifice myself for others but can't receive it back. And I remember recently someone blessing our family, and I had such a hard time with receiving it. I'm like, I don't know if I can really say yes to this. And the Lord said, if you can say yes to this, then if you're having a hard time saying yes to this, then how can you be so okay with receiving my grace? Is my grace and my sacrifice on the cross, is it cheaper than what they're doing for you? And understand that Jesus' suffering is meant to target the pride in your heart and dissolve it. In our heart. Whether we're somebody who has an arm's length at God and says, Lord, God, I don't really believe in you. I'm not going to give my life to you. But oh my goodness, would we see that the King of the universe chose suffering and he chose death. And even in his final moments, he said to the Lord, he said to his Father in heaven, he said, God, forgive them. Because all these people who are angry and attacking, they don't know what they're doing. Like, who does that? Jesus does. His suffering is meant to target the pride in our hearts and to dissolve it. It should make you feel helpless and depend fully on him. It should fill you with endless gratitude and thankfulness. It should deepen your surrender to him every single day. It should deepen your love for him and to keep you from measuring your faith by legalism and sacrifice. It should impact what you live for. We don't live for the American dream or a great retirement or great vacations, and all that stuff is good. It's all good. But that is not the meaning or purpose of any of our life. But we do live for it. We kneel our life to it. We come to the end of our days with a lot of regret, wondering how our relationships fell apart or what meaning or what impact did we really leave behind. Where's our legacy? The Lord wants us to live for him because with living for Jesus comes legacy. Comes legacy. And understand that as his suffering is meant to target the pride in our heart and dissolve it, it is also very much meant to put in perspective the value of your life. Because understanding humility is not thinking that you are dirt. We have that weird kind of mixed idea of like, well, if I'm not prideful and I'm humble, that means like I'm dirt. No. You're not dirt. Jesus didn't suffer for dirt. For you and for me. People that he loved, that he cared for. And we talked about it last week, that beautiful moment where Jesus is teaching in John chapter 15. He says, there's no greater love than this. There's no greater love than one who lays down his life for my friends, and you're my friends. Wow. Understand that we find our identity, our value, our purpose, our meaning for our life in Christ. And your life matters to him because, oh my goodness, he gave his for you. Not so that you could have a get out of jail free card in your back pocket, not so that you can try to prove yourself, so that he could completely change your life. I love what he says in Matthew 20:28. It says that Jesus gives his life as a ransom. He gives his life as a ransom. Do you know what a ransom is? It's what is given in exchange for the hostage. And you and I were the hostage. He gave himself because when he looked at who was being held hostage and the spiritual and eternal consequences of our sin that were holding us hostage, he wanted to do whatever he could to set us free. Set you free. For me. Friends, understand this morning as we celebrate Easter, oh my goodness, can we turn our eyes and turn our attention to the cross and see how our King came as a suffering servant. And these are not just words that we share in our Christian language. These are parts of who God is and at the heart of his love for us. Oh my goodness, be reminded of what it cost him to do, to care for you, and to rescue you. Pride always has a way. Stubbornness always has a way of ruining our life. It ruins our marriages. It ruins our families. It ruins so many things. It ruins our relationship with Jesus. Understand that. We say often in our society that pride goes before the fall, and very much so. May we not miss that the cross and Jesus' suffering should wake us up to our pride and help us fully belong to him. As I shared earlier, I didn't grow up in church. We occasionally would go to an Easter service as a kid with my grandparents. You see, I was a young guy who hated all of this, made fun of people who walked with Jesus and believed in this old book. I was angry at the world for the brokenness in our family and it being ripped to shreds. But then on my 15th birthday, I was given a Bible, and I remember I was about ready to throw it across the room. Why not a video game? Why not something way better? But we were poor, and I knew that's all my mom could give us. She was raising myself and my younger brother. And so I remember it sat in my room for months and months and months, and then I felt stirred to read it. She in that time had been bringing us and dropping us off at church and then picking us up when it was over. Man, I wish she would have stayed. I remember I began to read and began to see who Jesus is. That he is the King of the world who is so much more than just real, that he is close. That he wants to be a friend. He's not this king that we should fear and run away from, but one who wants to be